Hello everybody. In today's video we're going to get started on a little IFR series. Now I'm just sitting there kind of breaking it down as to far how am I going to go through all of IFR flying in a set of videos, and I realized kind of the simplest way to do it is going to be basically have one video dedicated to kind of showing you what it looks like on paper, and then having a couple of videos to actually show you what it looks like in the air. So for us, we're going to be concentrating on kind of the structure as far as departures, arrivals, and approaches. There's a lot more to instrument flying than just that, but we're going to leave those kind of details and those kind of skills out for a little later on for those of you once you start to grow in skill. And I've had a little bit more time kind of playing with the simulator, and Microsoft has had a little bit more time to kind of clean up some of the stuff that's been going on inside of the simulator. So let's go ahead and break it down, shall we? So first things first, if you are flying an IFR flight, the first thing you need to do is you need to fill out a flight plan that is an IFR flight plan. In the real world, at least in the United States, you have to be certified to be able to actually safely do one of these. Technically, you could file an IFR flight plan without being IFR rated. Simply doing so can get you in a lot of trouble though, because the assumption is if you're going to file an IFR flight plan, you're probably going to be flying in IFR conditions, which you can't actually do unless you're certified to do. But again, I'm not worried about that today. So if you take a look at our little situation here, we've got ourselves a lovely New England, and you can see that the weather is positively horrible. Turns out there was a hurricane, and it makes things a little cloudy. So in the real world, we'd probably want to go ahead and plan an IFR flight. Again, IFR simply means instrument flight rules. We're using instruments in order to navigate. So there's a bunch of different ways we can do that. We've got GPS, we have ADF, we have VOR. In the old days, you had LORAN, you had, I guess you can't use stellar navigation because, again, you probably couldn't see through the clouds anyway. And there are a couple other different methods too. Once you head out way into the Eastern Hemisphere, you get things like RSPN, you get SHORAN, all sorts of really slick tricks that we can use navigating via instruments. For us, we're going to keep most of our instrumentation / technique limited to more or less VOR and once in a while GPS as well. So let's go ahead and pretend we're going to do a flight. So our flights are going to be broken into a couple different phases. You're going to have the departure phase, you're going to have the en route phase, you're going to have the approach phase, or the arrival phase, I should say, then the approach phase. For this video, we're going to only be concentrating on the departure phase. So let's pretend we're taking off from Bradley here. And let's pretend we're traveling over to, let's go to Manchester, New Hampshire, something nice and simple like that. So normally, when we're traveling using IFR routes, we have to travel along all these airways that we mentioned in the previous video. So what I'll do is I'll go flip to World High, and you can see there's a lot of really good choices. One thing I do notice is that all of these airways are all Q Airways, Quebec Airways. These ones are going to be GPS referenced. The black ones, the jetways, are going to be VOR referenced. For our particular flight right now, we're in a little bit of trouble because we can basically pop up here, but then we'd have to use our GPS to get ourselves all the way to our destination. Let's go take a look if there's any low altitude airways we might be able to take advantage of. Oh, definitely looks like that. No, that's not too bad. We can work with that. Looks like if we went up here, we could take the Victor 106. Checking my arrows, looks like that looks pretty good. So we'll go pop up here real quick. This is Barnes Regional. This has got its own little VOR. We're going to jump onto the Victor 106. I can just type that in. Boop. And now we get ourselves a pretty successful flight plan. So that's basically all we'd have to do. So we'd file this and say, we're going to be traveling via the Victor 106 airway all the way up to Manchester. So now let's actually get to the departure part of things. So when you leave an aircraft, an airport, it is not unusual to have what they call a departure procedure. So if I were to actually click on this real quick, I'll go ahead and bring this up real fast. Another great website for this, by the way, is right here. You can see if I scroll all the way down, you get these things called departure procedures. A departure procedure really does two things. The first thing is it makes sure we don't hit anything. If we were, for example, I always like to use this as an example because this is really solid. If we were out in Aspen, there are gigantic mountains in the way. So you'll use a departure procedure not only to avoid obstacles, but to provide a pathway to get you off the ground into the air and into the IFR system as quickly and efficiently and safely as possible. Now, when you're down here, like in New York, where you have extremely congested airways, these departure procedures are basically lifesavers for air traffic control to keep all the traffic moving basically in the same direction. Note that you have two different kinds of departure procedures. You have a regular instrument departure procedure, and you have what they call a special that's going to be an obstacle procedure. In this case, here it is, SARD 3 obstacle. The difference being is that an obstacle departure procedure can be flown VFR. In this case, we're just going to be taking off, kind of going to the right and then going to the left. There's a huge mountain right here. Now, an instrument departure procedure is going to be a little bit different in that it is going to dictate what we need to do on instruments in order to escape from that particular airport and get onto our route. That's all a departure procedure is. Now, departure procedures are pretty straightforward for a number of different reasons. The first one is that basically it's going to tell you, by the way, one question you'll probably get, what departure procedure do I pick? Now, in the real world, air traffic control will dictate what departure procedure you're going to get stuck with. Now, the reality there is that you can say, I don't want a departure procedure, in which case you're going to get what they call radar vectors, where they're actually going to tell you what you need to do in order to get onto your flight plan. Now, this is a lot of work for air traffic control, which is why the departure procedures were developed in the first place. Note there are different kinds of departure procedures too. You have these, which are basically designed to be flown using VORs, and then you have what they'll call an RNAV departure procedure. That simply, such as the pick and four over here, I'm going back to here, let's go pop this one up, is a GPS-driven departure. Now, in the real world, you're like, oh, I have a GPS, I can do anything. Well, the reality is you can only fly things that you have certified GPSs for. A regular GPS is considered a reference GPS. A permanent installation with special antennas, you can actually use that for a reference. In which case, let's go ahead and show these two different procedures directly next to each other so you can get a pretty good look at it. All right, again, we're using case here. So this is going to be a GPS one, random navigation. And this one here is going to be a conventional one using VOR references. That's all there is to it. So what will happen a lot of times is you'll be on the ground, you say request IFR clearance to Manchester, and they'll go ahead and call you back and say via the such and such departure. So let's say in our case, they asked us to do it via the Coastal 7 departure. Now let me go ahead and open up that one real quick. This departure is kind of an interesting departure because if you actually look at it, here's our actual airport. And these are all the VORs and all the different waypoints we need to hit in order to safely get into our zone where our actual flight plan is. Now, taking a quick look at this, you'll realize that this particular departure procedure takes us straight south. You're also going to look at this for a minute and say, this is kind of complicated. I mean, it looks like we're taking off and we have to do something. There's no instructions. That's because in departure procedures, the instructions are actually kept separate from the actual procedure itself. So in my case, if I go back down to my departure procedure and actually open this one up, it will give you the instructions you need to do to get onto that departure procedure. So in this case, it says, climb heading 1 tree up to 900 feet. And you can see we just come over here and just sort of line them up. So if we were taking off runway 24, we climb 238 until we get called to Hartford VOR DME. And then from over here, it would just give us all the instructions we need to do. Now, there's one thing I'm going to throw out. This is kind of important here. And that's the fact that a period means finish all the steps prior to it before crossing this. Remember, air traffic control at any time can tell you to do something else. Now, let's make things a little bit more complicated here. You're going to notice on this particular departure procedure that, first of all, it's going south, which means we'd never want to use it anyway because Manchester is up north. And second of all, you'll notice it has a choice between Sherrill and Gettick. You're probably sitting there going, well, that makes things complicated. Well, the reality is it depends on where you're going. These two waypoints in the real world are significantly far apart. Let's actually bang that one out. We'll CRYL. I'll show you where Sherrill is. And let me show you where Gettick is. You can see that they actually line you up with two separate of these major airways. Again, once you zoom out a little bit, you can see all the basically crossing the Atlantic kind of airways here. So I'm going to leave that alone. So what you'll actually see sometimes when they say use this particular departure procedure, they'll say use the Gettick transition, in which case when we're following our instructions here, we're going to go ahead and follow it until we get here or air traffic control gives us something else to do. So that's kind of the basics of actually these things. In our case, if we were flying up to Manchester, we'd actually be setting it up so that we are following the other one. We're not going to be using this one. Let me go call that one up real quick. We'd be using this one down here called the Stella 1. I'm going to take a look real quick. Nope, I'm sorry, the Deer Park 3. Oh, that's an arrival. Oh, you caught me. I always make that mistake. I'm sorry. Bradley 4. We'd be taking the Bradley 4, which is even simpler because it's such a simple departure procedure. It literally says climb at this altitude to this altitude, and then they will literally just give you vectors here. This is a super simplified thing. The big thing here is it gives us our altitude right up at the tippy top, making our lives a little bit easier. So for the second half, this is again is going to be part 1. We're going to actually fly one of these departure procedures. I'm actually going to reset everything real quickly here. We'll do this one. And we'll go ahead and use that departure procedure that we saw a minute ago, that scary coastal one, because it's going to be a much better example for what I'm going to do here. All right, we'll go ahead and grab that. We'll dial in each one of these waypoints by hand. We're going to do by Hartford. We're going to go to Thumb. We're going to go to Yoder. We're going to go to Calverton, VOR. And we'll just assume we're going to Sherrill. Beautiful. So now that we know what our actual flight's going to look like, we need to figure out how in the simulator we're actually going to go through and find out all these different positions we need. So the first things first is going to be Hartford VOR. That's easy to find because we can literally dial this in directly in and proceed direct. Once we cross Hartford VOR, we're going to proceed along the 1-4 tree radial until we get to Thumb. Now you're sitting there going, how do we find Thumb with VOR? Well, if you go straight down here, you'll notice Hampton VOR has a radial 190 that would literally point to this. So when our two needles cross, we're going to know we hit Thumb VOR. After that, we're going to proceed on the 190. Again, this is going to be along Hampton's VOR. This is that radial to Yoder. Once we get to Yoder, we're going to go ahead and take a right turn. How do we find Yoder? Well, in this case, we're going to have to cross-reference Calverton VOR with Hampton VOR to find the spot. Once we find that, we're going to proceed direct to Calverton. This is going to be pretty easy along the 237 radial. Once we get to Calverton, we are then going to travel to, we'll take the Sherrill intersection, in which case we're going to do on the 2-1 tree radial from between 7,000 and 3,000 feet, and it's going to be a pretty hefty distance. Again, we're going to do this in a pretty quick plane so that we can do this. So this should be our little setup here. I'm going to have this kind of handy. In the real world, you'd have a big old book of these basically sitting on your lap. Now, if you're using the GPS, you could literally just select this departure and it will pick each one of these waypoints for us. Once we get over to the simulator side, which we'll do a little bit later this week, you'll have the opportunity to see how we're going to have to find each one of these points. Other than that, that's all there really is to a departure procedure. One thing notice, pay attention to your altitudes, make sure there's no minimum altitudes, and kind of always listen to air traffic control. Because even though you're on this particular procedure, expect them to give you different altitudes. For example, down here it says between 7,000 and 3,000 feet. In the real world, if you listen to the actual air traffic control, people get to about Yoder, and then they're basically told to go ahead and climb up to whatever their cruise altitude is going to be. So by the time they hit Gettick or Sherrill, they are way up there. So they don't have to worry about that too much. So once you've completed your departure, it's just a matter of flying to the destination and then setting yourself up for the approach. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful as far as explaining the basics. Again, I'm putting a lot of information here. This will make quite a bit more sense when we actually fly it a little later on in the simulator. Enjoy.